The results of the current crisis, the roots of the current crisis lie in poverty. The poverty of US subprime borrowers and the low earnings of Chinese workers and farmers. There needs to be massive forgiveness of principal in the US mortgage market, instead of limiting assistance only to service payments. In many ways, the program I've outlined is a plan for reconstruction and for installments of economic democracy. It involves large amounts of public ownership, but with the state delegating and ceding much authority to local, accountable public bodies, and doing a much more decentralized model than has been characteristic of social democracy, let alone state socialism of the Soviet style. I've not said much about the philosophical values that should imbue the socialist rescue effort. The American Declaration of Independence urged that all men were created equal and had the unalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. A socialist couldn't aspire to anything less, but would have to be sure that the happiness proposed was not conceived in some narrow individual mode, but fully embraced Alexander Pope's warning in his essay on man, that the happiness we justly call rests not in the good of one, but all. There's not a blessing individuals find, but some way leans or hearkens to the kind. Of course, Pope was not a full-blooded socialist. Still less was he, a revolutionary or a rebel. And the spirit of the American revolutionaries of 1776 would be, is very much more what is required than his small c conservatism. But I do think his evocation in the essay of collectivist realities and values is extremely powerful, and there is a socialist strand there. I just sort of reread it this morning and tremendously impressed by it once again. So Pope was one-sided in a different way. If his doctrine that true self-love and social are the same enunciates a strand of socialist philosophy, the colonial revolt asserted a right of rebellion not found in Pope. Classic goals of the French Republic, liberty, equality, and fraternity, takes us some way further, but only a little, and they're also not specifically socialist. Moreover, fraternity needs considerable qualification to distinguish it from communalism and nationalism. The UN Declaration of Human Rights is impressive, but doesn't mention environmental issues and offers little to stateless persons and Aboriginal peoples. Socialism in the 21st century should respect the goals of the 1948 Declaration and subsequent attempts to address racism and minority rights and ecological questions. But socialism itself addressed the vital issue of the workings of the global economy in ways that go beyond simply respect, important as it is, for human rights. The history of socialism in the 20th century is an extremely mixed bag, but nonetheless valuable for all that. Indeed, the multitude of crimes and blunders perpetrated in the name of socialism offer instruction and allow for the possibility of a more chastened and complex approach. The Soviet planned economy did in fact have some successes, arming the Red Army for the Battle of Stalingrad, at which time Western help still wasn't reaching the Soviet Union. It had some successes, but its colossal and appalling costs and its final debut mean that any repeat of this experiment is unlikely, to say the least. China has found another way, with public banks being far more important than the planning department. Of course, governments everywhere know they have to plan, and now do so over longer periods than the 5 years typically favoured by Gosplan. Responsible global governance will need to engage in rigorous resource planning, as proposed by the Austrian philosopher and political economist Otto Neurath right back in the 1920s. The socialist aim should be to tame and socialize market forces on a national, regional and global basis, but not to aim at outright suppression of the market. Here, Karl Polanyi's insights in the Great Transformation stand the test of time. Polanyi warned that land, labour and money should not be left to the anarchic sway of the market, but rather decommodified. Today's crisis was brought on by ceding to the sovereign claims of financial institutions and markets to be above regulation. Indeed, socialists must go further and use ownership as well as regulation to direct a responsible path of accumulation. The crucial instruments here may well prove to be truly accountable networks of public funds, with the latter the beneficiary of taxes on financial transactions and share levies. The classic French formula for a socialist order was that it would be based on the principle from each according to their ability, to each according to their need. And, at a basic level it retains some value and does go beyond liberalism and compassionate conservatism. However, better is the declaration by Marx and Engels that socialism recognizes that the free development of each requires the free development of all. This formula is not just a blank check, but a novel and distinctly socialist insight into the requirements of human flourishing. Thank
you. Okay, well, I'm going to speak, I think, a little bit more narrowly. These comments are directed primarily towards European social democratic or left parties. And I want to start off there by saying that in my comments, I make a strong difference or distinction between socialism as a broad movement and social democracy, which I see as a very specific strand of the socialist movement. And to my mind, social democracy is defined by two key principles. The first, which Robin also enunciated, although I might think of in a slightly different way, is this acceptance of capitalism, right? And I think this differentiates social democrats from their other colleagues in the socialist movement, especially historically. An acceptance of capitalism at the same time as they also recognize a very strong need, as you said, to sort of tame it or to box it in some way, to work towards decommodification, to use sort of Polanyi's great phrase rather. So that's one key tenet of the social democratic movement, a sort of acceptance of capitalism, but also a desire to sort of tame it or box it in. And then the second key tenet is was an early rejection, I think, of a sort of exclusive focus on the working class and a very clear rejection of a class conflict perspective. Social democrats very early on sort of were the folks within the socialist movement who decided that you very much needed to reach out to a wide range of groups and to sort of attract people from different parts of the socioeconomic spectrum, all of those people who might potentially have something to gain from some kind of taming of capitalism. Now, if we look at this part of the socialist movement up through, let's say, the early part of the 20th century, you can see that it was focused on two main things. And again, this is primarily in the European context. The first was the achievement of democracy, that is to say full universal suffrage and parliamentary democracy. And then the second was this sort of taming of capitalism, this trying to figure out some way, in the sort of Polanyi-esque way, of sort of not destroying capitalism, but figuring out ways you could kind of use it to achieve all the things that you liked, growth, higher incomes, a bigger pie to distribute, but not to allow its anarchic tendencies to sort of get out of hand. This was the goal of social democrats up through the interwar period, trying to figure out some way to kind of square this circle. Now, as we all know in this room, particularly in Europe, but also in the United States, these goals were achieved, of course, by the end of the Second World War, right? Democracy comes to stay to Western Europe, and all countries in their own way more or less kind of agree on the need to kind of fetter capitalism in some way, to agree to greater provisions for social welfare, to some kind of institutionalized welfare state, to a need to use governments to kind of protect citizens from markets. This happened in very different ways in different European countries and to different extents, but all over Europe this was a major shift from earlier in the 20th century, this kind of acceptance that we now consider to be the sort of post-war order. Now, the problem is that once these two big goals of the social democratic movement had been achieved, the movement itself, despite having achieved its goals, started to change. And if you look back,